Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Today, we're delving into what it means to return education to the states. Our guest is Lindsay Fryer, a longtime federal education policy expert and former senior staffer on Capitol Hill, who played a key role in the most recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Lindsay's the founder and president of Lodestone, D.C. In this episode, we get a little wonky, but in the best way. We talk about the federal role in education, how Washington accumulated so much influence over what has historically been state and local responsibility. We dig into ESEA and its most recent iterations, NCLB and ESSA, and Lindsay shares her thoughts on what the administration can and cannot do through guidance, waivers, and other actions, and what governors, state chiefs, and Congress can do to shift power closer to states, communities, and families. Lindsay Fryer, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Nice to see you, Ginny. Always fun to spend time together.
Well, we talk a lot about education policy at events, and we also talk about education from a parent perspective. Today, we're not going to delve into the parent side of things, but we just want to remind listeners that, we're in this too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're navigating this as parents. I have teenagers, you have younger kids. Education policy matters to us on a number of levels. But now let's get wonky.
My favorite.
And delve into policy. Big picture, we're going to be talking about returning education to the states, but why do we even need to be having that conversation? Why is there this perception, or perhaps this reality, that Washington has been granted so much power over education when historically and in reality, it is a state and local responsibility?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, if you look at the history of federal involvement in education, I mean, there's no doubt that it's grown over time since, basically just Title I and maybe IDEA or original funding. I think the perception of the federal role in education, certainly I'd say Republicans and Democrats share a different view, but ultimately I'd say everyone can agree on the fact that the federal role should be to help the most vulnerable students access and get through education, right? On a level playing field to be able to compete in whatever the next step is, if we're talking about K-12 or higher ed. And then I'd say, just in terms of looking at the federal role, probably, it's been increasing over time, as I mentioned, but probably NCLB was the first time where you have a significant number of requirements for just a tiny amount of money. So as you know well, education is 10% or less than the annual operating budget in the state. The federal money is less than 10%. And the amount of rules that states have to comply with are pretty significant, not to mention that the oversight that the U.S. Department of Education has exercised over these programs and, checking compliance. It's Senator Alexander, my former boss, used to say, it's become a mother may I exercise with the Department of Education rather than a, hey, check the box, this is what we're doing, letting you know. It's now asking permission for everything. So, I think when the Trump administration came in this go around, they were very serious about returning education control to the states. Now, in my opinion, that doesn't mean there's no federal role. As I led off this, there is an important role to protect civil rights. There is some money involved, and from a taxpayer perspective, you should make sure that's money is spent properly. There are requirements in law that exist that Congress passed that the department needs to make sure are complied with. But to me, that's not adding tons of new requirements or injecting the department's opinions as to whether or not a state is doing something well enough. It's, are they doing it from a compliance standpoint and kind of letting the states run with what they want to do innovatively or not for their students. The states have the right to be right and the right to be wrong. And that's an important thing to remember. So I'll stop there and see if you have any responses to any of that.
Well, yeah, we need to delve into a lot of what you've brought up here. And I do want to start with that acknowledgement that there's an appropriate role when it comes to civil rights enforcement for the federal government. I don't think anyone who's seriously engaged in this discussion would disagree with that statement. There are these federal laws, there are these federal protections in place. There's an Office for Civil Rights, just at the U.S. Department of Education, but at other federal agencies. And I mean, is that your sense too, that there's pretty much an across the board acceptance that that's the reality and that's an appropriate role for the federal government?
I think so. Yeah, I don't think I've heard anyone debate that. The role and enforcement of civil rights, I think, can be debated, like how the department goes about interpreting and enforcing civil rights law. But certainly, I don't think anyone disagrees that there's a federal role there. I personally absolutely think that.
Right. And I do think that there's a decent amount of fear mongering out there that even though there is this federal law, IDEA, that is designed to protect students with disabilities, again, there's fear mongering around like potential threats to IDEA, but that law hasn't been reauthorized in over 20 years, and nobody's touching it. It's not going away. And there does seem to be an across the board sense of support for students with disabilities. So I just want to set those two things aside so that we can delve into other aspects. What we're going to be delving into more is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, and its various iterations. So let's address one of the acronyms that you threw out there, and that's NCLB versus the current iteration of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESSA. You played a huge role in that transition from one era to the other. Can you walk us through like kind of the major differences in those two?
Yeah. So at a very high level, and No Child Left Behind (NCLB) was the first time that you had requirements in federal law for all students need to be assessed using the same assessment annually in grades 3 through 8, and once in high school in reading and math. There had to be state accountability systems that would look at the achievement of schools using test scores and things like graduation rate. Later, student growth came into play, but very basic measures to figure out as a state how do my schools compare to one another. And then NCLB had pretty specific cascading sanctions for what happened when schools were deemed as failing by the federal law. So that was NCLB, and I'd say the other thing that was very interesting about that is there was a deadline that by 2014, 100% of students would be proficient in reading and math. If you ask the original architects of NCLB, which was like 2001, 15-ish, 14-ish years later, they assumed that Congress would have reauthorized the law, right, in between 2001 and 2014. But alas, that did not happen. So over time, as I mentioned, the sanctions became increasingly stringent. And so, we opened this conversation with what's the federal role here. I mean, the law got very prescriptive as what happens when you're deemed as failing. And the department added on a whole bunch of regulations too, starting with the Bush department, and then the Obama department added a bunch of their own flavor as to what school improvement looked like. And so the law basically was fundamentally broken. Of course, not 100% of students were proficient in 2014. The department, then started to waive portions of the law and put their own requirements in place. So like when Arne Duncan was the secretary, he'd said, rather than requiring every teacher to be highly qualified, you have to have a teacher evaluation system. So, we don't have to get into all the details there, but basically because the law was fundamentally broken and the Congress wasn't reauthorizing it, the agency had to step in and fill these gaps. And I don't blame them for doing that, because certainly like the law just wasn't working. And so finally in 2015, after years and years of debate, Congress had the political pressure to reauthorize the law. And that was where I was. I was on the Senate Help Committee at the time. I started in the House and moved to Senate, and worked in both places to reauthorize. And we kept the fundamentals of the law the same. I wouldn't say it was like a drastic change, but the biggest thing that we right-sized was giving states more ownership over what indicators to include in their accountability systems to rate schools. And then particularly on the school improvement section that I mentioned, really leaving that up to the states. So you identify your schools, you do a needs assessment to figure out what's wrong, and then you tell us what you're going to do to fix your schools. The federal government completely hands off on that, and there was a lot of prohibitions against secretarial involvement. So the idea was to right-size the federal role from where it had moved pretty significantly in NCLB. And I think we did accomplish that for sure.
There's an underlying education law, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that's been around since 1965? And reauthorization means taking a look at that core law and making these adjustments. We're in the ESSA era, Every Student Succeeds Act era, and that's been the case for over a decade now. You guys just, a number of you who were involved in that reauthorization recently had an event celebrating that 10th anniversary of ESSA. Are state and local education leaders fully aware that we're in the ESSA era, that NCLB is over?
It's such a good question. I mean, so 10 years ago when I was on the Hill working on this, I did think that, and my boss, Senator Alexander, said, this new flexibility will unleash this era of innovation in states and districts. Did that happen? Probably a mixed bag. At the end of the day, education is a people business and leadership matters a lot. If you have a leader that will take responsibility for their state system and say, this is my vision, let's go for it, you will get results and you will achieve what you want to achieve, right? But other leaders, I think, were just, because of this, as we've been talking about this whole time, the increasing intervention of the Department of Education, the U.S. Department, into state decision making, just a compliance fear of, am I allowed to do this, right? And so I think there was like this idea of now you have flexibility is a huge culture shift for a lot of them. And so some states took advantage, other states probably didn't. Also, if you dive into the details of the law, there is a lot of like interesting new flexibilities that states might not have been aware that they could take advantage of. And so now we're kind of revisiting this conversation with the Trump administration, like, how flexible is the law? What is it that you don't realize you can do, right, without coming to the department, which I think is a very good thing. The question, though, is at the end of the day, it has to be up to the state leader to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take charge here and be innovative. And this department, I think, will say you can do that. But it is a complete culture shift and change from the interactions probably over the past several decades with the U.S. Department to states.
Well, and let's be honest, like the state leaders, and we're often talking about state education chiefs, commissioners, superintendents, they're busy people. They're not there combing through the intricacies of the law and interpreting the flexibilities. They are responding day to day in whatever the crisis is, and they are responding to their governor, to their state legislature, to every angry district superintendent who's calling them that day. So I do want to put it out there that the state chiefs have a lot of responsibility, and maybe letting them know, actively informing them, hey, this is what ESSA says. Here are the flexibilities. We are in a new era, is something that does need to be done to kind of cut through the noise that they're experiencing day to day in their job. All right, so let's dig into what you were alluding to. You were saying that in this push to return education to the states, the Trump administration, some officials within the Department of Education are maybe working on communicating, like, hey, there's some flexibilities under ESSA, under existing law. We're open to them. Let's move forward with that. So that aspect, that putting out guidance, dear colleagues, sending that message, that's one lever to return education to the states, to show that there's an interest in shifting power from the federal government to the state government. What are some of the other big levers that they've got?
Yeah. So as you just mentioned, putting out proactively, reminder, here's all the things you can do. There's also something called Waiver authority, which this department has spent a lot of time on. And what that means is the law has specific provisions that can be waived by the secretary if the state has a better idea or approach that they want to put in place to increase student outcomes. So this department has proactively invited states to say, if you want to do something different, if you want to waive specific requirements in the law, give us your plan and let's talk about how this is good for kids. So there's many states tackling that, and probably more so too once we see more approvals come into place for those waivers. That's one thing. I would say, as we're thinking about this conversation too, it shouldn't only be a U.S. Department exercise, right? I think advocacy groups on the ground in their particular states should work with their state officials to just, again, take control over what's going on and say, these are the things we want to do. And they should proactively, just start doing things without asking permission, as long as they're not directly violating the law. I think we need to get out of this mindset of we always have to ask US Ed for permission. No, I think there's a ton of things that you should just go and do if they're good for kids. So that's another thing, like, grassroots groundswell up to help realize and actualize these flexibilities. And then the other thing that I think is a very important role, federal role, we talked about civil rights, students with disabilities. I think data collection on the status of achievement across the country is a hugely important federal role. Evaluation of federal programs, and also sharing best practices and highlighting spots where things are happening really well across the country. This administration and prior ones too, Republican and Democrat, have done a good job of saying, let's visit this school, let's highlight something good that's happening, and let other states and districts know about this best practice. So to me, it's copycat is the highest form of flattery, letting other states know good things that other states are doing. The department can absolutely highlight good things that are increasing student achievement at the end of the day, and that's a really important federal role.
Let's go back to the beginning of the list, and that's the waivers. And Lindsay, I'm a school choice person, like all of this,
Yeah.
NCLB, ESSA, waivers, like this is not my thing. But I have had a good conversation with Haley Sannon from the U.S. Department of Education here on the podcast about their vision for waivers. And since then, there's been news on that front. The state of Iowa had put in a waiver application. And then, according to the press release, they were awarded the first returning education to the states waiver. So waivers come in big and small packages, from what I understand. Was this a big one, the Iowa waiver?
So, in some senses, yes. Like, did Iowa fully restructure their education system, turn everything upside down? No, but to be fair, the governor and the chief in Iowa didn't want to do that. Their big vision was, let's get more flexibility in the federal funding, albeit, no, it's 10% of less than our overall budget. But if we can better align federal funding to our state priorities, we can just bolster the things that we want to do that we know are working for kids. And so ESEA is structured with multiple different funding streams, each with their own requirements attached, right? Back to this increasing federal role. And Iowa's proposal is essentially to, at the state level, take all the money that they get in separate silos and be allowed to combine it to, again, further the supports that they're giving to things that matter to them as a state. So that's certainly something that's never been done before. And an important fact here is, one thing that cannot be waived, can't be touched at all unless by Congress, is how money actually gets to your state. So the formula by which you get your dollars cannot be touched. Like, that's a big no-no. So Iowa said, all right, we're not going to touch how much money ultimately we or districts get, but once we at the state get our portion of the money, can we combine it all and use it for specific purposes that are beneficial for our students? So it's the first of its kind. We've never seen this kind of flexibility exercised. Granted, most of the money, 95% of federal money, flows down to the district. So we're not talking about like bazillions of dollars here. I can't, in Iowa, I think it's
Is that technical?
$2
Bazillions?
million. It's $2 million, I think.
There were 8 million was thrown around
8
at the
million.
press
That might be
conference. And like,
right.
what is this 8 million that you're talking about? Like,
Yeah, I think that's all the like formula funding that I mentioned that Iowa now can combine to do with what it will.
and you're saying, when you say Iowa, the SEA, the state,
The state, yes, the state
because
education
that
agency.
95%, the vast bulk of the federal funding goes by formula to the districts.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the state takes their chunk off the top as the state education agency, and they can use that for statewide initiatives of their choosing. So I think it's interesting. Again, groundbreaking, earth shattering, not really, but that's okay. I mean, we're just kind of entering into new territory here. And funding flexibility has been something that state chiefs have been complaining about forever. I mean, that was a huge issue on the Hill when I was there. And so, let's see what Iowa does with this. I think the other side of the argument, though, is when you collapse, these categorical funding streams that each have specific purposes and requirements, one of which is for English language learners, for example. One is for migrant students. One is for neglected and delinquent students. If you combine all those requirements together in a pot, are those students going to be left behind? Are we going to inadvertently not ensure that those students are getting their needs met? It's a fair argument, but I say, why don't we let the states try? I mean, the states that are applying for this money, these waivers, have to justify to the department how this is good for students overall and specific groups of students. Like, that's blatantly in law that you have to describe that. So I say, let's give them a chance. There should be some back end monitoring to make sure students aren't getting left behind or forgotten. But the more requirements and like squeeze you do on money with these requirements, like there's only so many things you can do. And if those things aren't working, why not try something different? And I think I am more on the side of, we've been doing the same thing for 20 plus years. Let's let states do something different and see if we have a different result.
When you're saying back-end monitoring, is that happening now? Like, we know that we have essentially an education crisis on our hands with when we're looking at the NAEP scores and we see the results. They're heartbreaking. Um, what has the US Department of Education been doing, like, with monitoring or ensuring that that's not the case? Like, that.
Yeah. So it's a great question. So as I mentioned, there has been this increasing back and forth with the department and states about asking permission for everything. I will honestly say COVID changed a lot of that dynamic. I mean, we're talking about these individual waiver requests that states put into place. Well, during COVID, the department said you don't have to test or identify schools for, I think it was like three school years, maybe two for sure at least. And so the monitoring was basically turned off during COVID. So then to turn that back on has taken a significant amount of time. Um, and so how much monitoring is occurring? It's probably, it's not what it used to be, but maybe that's a good thing. I do have questions, right, just about how the department monitorings. There's these things that they do called like desktop monitoring, where they're just like at their computer reviewing pages or whatever. I don't know the specifics. Someone at the department would have to tell you. But to me, is that really digging in and like getting into the fundamentals of like, is this money working for kids? That's not really the purpose of the monitoring as it has been. And maybe the department should change that to focus on outcomes more than, dotting the I's and crossing the T's on every little thing, which doesn't have anything to do with good outcomes for kids at the end of the day. So we
Yeah.
probably need to right size and change that process a bit. But I don't know how substantial it's been since COVID, quite honestly.
Let's go back to the waivers. Iowa's not the only state that's put in a waiver application. Another high-profile state that's done that is Indiana. I'm sure that there are others trickling in, big and small, as far as waiver requests. Would you say that the Iowa process is a model for other states? Is it a starting point, or, like, is it a ceiling? How should we interpret what's unfolded with Iowa?
I wouldn't say a ceiling. I do think in the realm of funding flexibility, as we just talked about, it's definitely a model. If I'm a
Okay.
state and I want to do that, let's start with where Iowa started and then go further. To your point, Indiana, they didn't just pursue funding flexibility. They also, two other thematics that we've seen emerging with states interested in the waivers are, a lot of states run a federal accountability system to meet federal requirements, and then they have a state system that, like, for example, could rate their schools A through F. Why they have two systems, it's a question to me. A lot of states want to combine those systems or just use their state system. So Indiana is one of those. And then the other big thing, which is, this is probably the most exciting thing I've seen in waivers. Indiana wants to completely reconfigure how they intervene in low performing schools. As we started talking about, a main tenet of the federal law is use your accountability system to figure out which schools are not doing well and then intervene to put in place school improvement efforts to help them. The law has been prescriptive over time. It's more flexible now, but it is pretty clear that only the schools that are identified as failing have to be prioritized for money. Well, Indiana has a pretty interesting notion that why are we just funding failure with these dollars? If we have high performing schools, why don't we reward them and perhaps open up slots for more kids to go there, or take some of the individualized, personalized strategies that are working and apply that to more kids in failing schools? So Indiana's notion is flipping around how we fund school improvement and allowing more schools to take advantage of it. Ultimately, the dollars will still help those students in failing schools, but focus more on serving the students rather than the system that hasn't been serving them, which I know well. I think it's very innovative. I think it's interesting. I know the department is interested in it from what I've heard. So that to me is something to watch for states to replicate if they do get approved.
Okay, so Iowa has gotten the green light, go ahead. They got their waiver. We're waiting to find out what happens with Indiana, and we'll stay tuned as other waiver applications and approvals unfold. Something that we haven't talked about yet and might not be relevant to this returning education to the states is the interagency agreements, or IAAs. That's something that got a lot of attention in Washington and does seem to be really truly unfolding with components of the US Department of Education moving to other federal agencies through these interagency agreements. Do you think that this is going to impact the states? Does this have relevance to the returning education to the states, to lessening federal power?
The $1,000,000 question, Jenny. So big picture here, we had the President Trump and Secretary McMahon vowing to return control to the states. One way to do that is closing the department. The department cannot be closed without Congress. Congress would have to actually vote to close the Department of Ed. There's not bipartisan support to do that. So to, the Secretary McMahon's team's credit, they're trying to creatively figure out ways to dismantle without dismantle. And so the idea is, all right, what pieces and different programs do we operate that might be better served elsewhere? A lot of the K-12 programs that we've been discussing, there's a proposal to move them over to the Department of Labor to better connect education and labor. I think, that's a fair justification. Here's my thing. The department acknowledges that they can't do this, right, unilaterally without Congress. Are we just moving deck chairs and creating bureaucracy in another agency, or is this really going to make a difference? I don't know. But that's my concern, right? This is a ton of effort. It's not like you can just snap your fingers overnight and everything transfers from Department of Ed to DOL. You have to train staff on new systems. You have to physically move them. You have to, communicate to states who their grant managers are now. It's not insignificant. And so is this going to make the process more efficient? I don't know, Jenny. That's my question. And because this is a temporary solution, is then another presidency going to come in and undo it all, right? And then confuse states in terms of who they have to talk to. I don't buy the argument that I've heard from a lot of critics. Oh, states are going to have to talk to multiple agencies. It's so confusing. That's not true. States talk to multiple agencies every single day.
Yeah.
The question to me is, what problem are we solving? Does this make it more efficient, less confusing for states? Maybe. The one really good piece of news that came out, they started with the career tech programs of the department, which are very small, and moved them over to labor. Labor houses a lot of the workforce development programs that the U.S. has. So now there is much better coordination between CTE and what's called the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act programs, WIOA programs. They're aligning their state plan submissions, hopefully aligning reporting requirements. That's a good thing. So, I will reserve judgment on to whether or not this is good for higher ed and K-12 until we see that process unfold. But at the end of the day, I hope this is not just compliance in another building, right? And that's my concern here for something that's not permanent, for certainly.
Well, I've spoken with Lindsay Burke again on the podcast, a leader at the Department of Education, about that IAA process, and she describes it as a proof of concept and something for Congress to consider when they're thinking about actions that they can take to return education to the states and to diminish federal power. So let's see how that proof of
Stay
concept
tuned,
unfolds. Definitely watching that with interest. Before we wrap up, let's talk about what can't be done by an administration and what has to be done by Congress on this topic. So, as you were saying, Congress has to dismantle the Department of Education. They created it, so they would be the ones that would have to dismantle it officially. There are other aspects of this. We keep saying returning education to the states, but like making things easier for states, giving states more flexibility. So things like block grants, I guess consolidating some of these ESEA titles, taking down a bit of the federal accountability compliance regime. A number of those things would have to be done by Congress. Anything else that Congress should be considering or looking at if they're interested in doing this?
Yeah, I mean, there's this kind of ideological question about the proper federal role, which is what we've been talking about this whole time, and what needs to be required by federal law versus where you let states lead. And that balance is always one that I think is interesting. So to me, a next iteration of ESEA should not just be tinkering on the edges. It should be like have a justifiable reason to fundamentally redesign the system. And perhaps some of these waivers will yield new ideas that should be considered by Congress and statute, right? So the waivers are also temporary. The department can waive these requirements. I think it's for 4 years with an opportunity to extend. So perhaps we'll learn something from Indiana or Iowa or other states that will apply about, all right, actually, without having these federal requirements, this is a better way to go. So I think there's more to learn here. But one thing that I know Iowa worked on pretty hard, and you actually see alluded to in their approval letter, there are reporting requirements in statute to just show how you're spending the money, how, student outcomes, like school report cards, basically, which you and I know as parents are often extremely hard to understand.
So much clicking, and that's when you know that you deserve to see this information and you're trying to
You
find
can't
it.
find it. Yeah. I really think, and this is something the department could do without Congress. I mean, Congress could certainly in the next iteration streamline the reporting requirements. That's always a great idea. But actually, by administrative action, agency after iteration after iteration of the department leadership has added tons of reporting requirements on top of what's required in law. There oftentimes definitions don't match up. You have to report it to like 3 different offices, and the
Wow.
states are like, where do these reports even go? Who's using them? To me, a huge thing that this department could do before they leave, which Iowa has already poked them on, is just redo all the federal reporting. And I would even say, and someone who's a federalist, from the perspective of a parent, why don't you just have a standard template that every state has to fill out and put on their website that has the same information? States can add on to it if they want, but it has to be easy to find, very understandable, clean, simple format, maybe has 5 things that every state, like every parent might want to know. And then leave the rest of the stuff for the researchers who want to go dig on the website for other stuff. I mean, that could be a huge thing this department could do. It's a very big undertaking. I'm not going to lie about that. There's 9 different data systems they'd had to look at. But how great would it be from a transparency, informing parents perspective? You know that you go to any state or even school district's website and you can find the same 5 things in the same place. How great would that be, right? I think that could be something that this department should administratively consider before they leave. And they don't need Congress to do that. So that would be my one recommendation that
Okay,
I'd
so
love to see.
that's your recommendation for the administration. Hope they're
Yeah.
listening. Recommendations for Congress? Not sure how much is going to be getting done in Congress the next few years, but if they want to be exploring things through hearings, through discussion, through preliminary work on this topic, what should be the priorities there?
Yeah. So I think the first is let's wait and see a little bit to how the waivers play out and if there's lessons learned there. Redesigning the concept of how to intervene in low performing schools, like why fund failure? Should we rethink about federal funding since it's only so small, incentivizing good behavior, rewarding good behavior, and just rethinking how we do federal formulas and federal incentive funding? There's not much of that in ESEA. That would be another recommendation. We talked about increased transparency. Yeah, I mean, I think those are good starts. The other thing that I know you care a lot about, Ginny, is we have choice exploding across the states, and we have multiple models of doing that. We have public school choice. We have private school choice. We now have this new tax credit that will shake up the system potentially a little bit. And we're moving into an age of we're already there, but personalized learning, individualized instruction is a very important thing to watch. We know all kids don't learn the same way. So to me, figuring out how to, and it gets a little bit into incentive funding, but better fund student needs directly rather than systems over time. That would be a complete overhaul of formulas, but I think that's a worthwhile venture to explore as we look at these different choice models across the state, which do fund families, right? And that would be something I think Congress should look at. Let's see how the federal tax credit intersects with the state programs, and ultimately, how do we help students and families make better choices that benefit them? That would be a next iteration.
Okay, so we've heard your advice to the administration, your advice to Congress, one final component, your advice to governors and state chiefs on who might be interested in returning education to the states, taking power from Washington, shifting it down to what they're doing. Apply for waivers, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughtfully apply for waivers. Do a good job. Any other tips for them?
Yeah, I mean, this probably goes back to what I said earlier. Stop asking for permission. I
Right.
mean, just figure out what you wanna do, what your vision is, and how to actualize it, and go with it. I mean, you know best, how to best serve your constituents, your school districts, and the students and families in your state, and so you don't need to ask Washington what to do there. I'd say just go for it. Pay attention to all the things that we know you care about, individual students' needs, special population, students with disabilities, data reporting. I think that's critical, right? But just kind of take that on and go for it and stop asking for permission. And back to the original thing, apply for waivers, but also realize the flexibilities that you probably already have that aren't taking advantage of. Like do a little homework, work with someone like me, someone like you, like even the department to just figure out how to take advantage of the flexibilities that you already have.
Yeah, I'll throw one more name. I work with someone like Jim Blue, co-founder of Defensive Freedom Institute, who also has an expertise that few have in DC. I think it's like you and Jim.
Very wonky.
Handful of others who know these titles and intricacies backwards and forwards. Last question for you. I can't believe that there are 3 more years of this administration.
I know.
But in 3 years, as we reach the end of the administration, what do you think could be the evidence that power has shifted, that we have made progress on returning education to the states?
It's a great question because some of things will certainly remain the same. I don't expect a reauthorized K-12 law. I don't expect the department building to no longer be open. I don't know if I'll get in trouble for saying that. I think there will be a Department of Ed in 4 years, albeit something that looks different. But I'll hang my hat on what I said before. A better working relationship between the department and states that is not compliance driven, but focuses ultimately on how are we using the funds to better serve students and looking at student outcomes, more transparency around that, and just this like getting out of this compliance mode, like allowing innovation to thrive. That would be a huge, huge thing, in my opinion. Just right sizing that federal role. It's not a zero role, but it should be, states should lead here. And it feels like the U.S. Department has been leading for so long. So let's states back in that driver's seat and see what they can do when they're given some flexibility.
Well, in 3 long years from now, we'll see where
Yes, we will see.
Well, Lindsay, thank you for your commitment to prioritizing students rather than systems and supporting this effort to shift the power to states, to communities, and to families. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for all your work, too. It's always fun to collaborate on both federal things and Virginia things. We share that passion, too. So more to come on that.
Yes.
Great to talk to you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defensive Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.